The effect of the stock market crash had been disastrous. There was growing violence as an angry population took out their frustration on the corporations who were seen to have caused this disaster. Then, in 1932, a new president was elected who was also going to use the power of the state to control the free market. But his aim was not to destroy democracy, but to strengthen it. And to do this, he was going to develop a new way of dealing with the masses.
I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. But in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power.
It was the start of what would become known as the New Deal. Roosevelt assembled a group of young technocrats and planners in Washington. He told them that their job was to plan and run giant new industrial projects for the good of the nation. Roosevelt was convinced that the stock market crash had shown that laissez-faire capitalism could no longer run modern industrial economies. It had become the job of government. Big business was horrified, but the New Deal attracted the admiration of the Nazis, especially Joseph Goebbels.
Wir betrachten die wirtschaftliche Entwicklung in Amerika mit dem allergrößten positiven Interesse. Und wir sind dort der festen Überzeugung, dass Präsident Roosevelt und seine Berater auf dem richtigen Wege sind. Es handelt sich in der Tat um das größte wirtschaftliche und soziale Problem aller Zeiten. Die vielen Millionen Arbeitslosen, die ihre Plätze an den Maschinen und in den Kontoren verloren haben, wieder an ihre alten Arbeitsstellen zurückzuführen. Das kann nicht allein der privaten Initiative überlassen werden. Ausschlaggebend ist, dass die öffentliche Hand mit positiven Maßnahmen eingreift.
But although Roosevelt, like the Nazis, was trying to organize society in a different way, unlike the Nazis, he believed that human beings were rational and could be trusted to take an active part in government. Roosevelt believed it was possible to explain his policies to ordinary Americans and take into account their opinions. To do this, he was helped by the new ideas of an American social scientist called George Gallup.
Favorite reading of New Deal Washington, the survey of U.S. public opinion. From offices at Princeton, New Jersey, a famed statistician, Dr. George Gallup, tells Washington from week to week what the nation is thinking. And in New York, Fortune magazine's analyst, Elmo Roper, compiles for publication a continuous record of the nation's approval or disapproval of how the country is being run.
Gallup and Roper rejected Bernays' view that human beings were at the mercy of unconscious forces and so needed to be controlled. Their system of opinion polling was based on the idea that people could be trusted to know what they wanted. They argued that one could measure and predict the opinions and behaviour of the public if one asked strictly factual questions and avoided manipulating their emotions.
Well, how about this one? Do you think Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal has been bad for the nation in general?
No, that question's loaded. It automatically suggests an answer.
Well, how about this? Is your present feeling toward President Roosevelt one of general approval or general disapproval?
That's better.
Prior to scientific polling, the view of many people was that you couldn't trust public opinion. It was irrational, that it was ill-informed, it was chaotic, unruly, and so forth. And so that opinion should be dismissed. But with scientific polling, I think it established very clearly that people are rational, that they do make good decisions, and this offers democracy a chance to be truly informed by the public, giving everybody a voice in the way the country is run. I know my father wouldn't necessarily say the voice of the public is the voice of God, but he did feel very much that the voice of the people is a rational voice and should be heard.
What Roosevelt was doing was forging a new connection between the masses and politicians, No longer were they irrational consumers who were managed by sating their desires. Instead, they were sensible citizens who could take part in the governing of the country. In 1936, Roosevelt stood for re-election. He promised further control over big business. To the corporations, it was the beginning of a dictatorship.
Roosevelt interferes with private enterprise and is running the country into debt for generations to come. The way to get recovery is to let business alone.
But Roosevelt was triumphantly re-elected.
It looks, my friends, like a real landslide this time. So please let me thank you again and tell you that I hope to see you all very soon and bid you an affectionate good night.
Faced with this, business now decided to fight back, to regain power in America. At the heart of the battle would be Edward Bernays and the profession he had invented, public relations.
Following that election, business people start to get together and start to carry on discussions, primarily in private, and they start talking to each other about the need to sort of carry on ideological warfare against the New Deal and to sort of reassert the sort of connectedness between the idea of democracy on the one hand and the idea of privately owned business on the other.
High-profile figures in American life, who had previously been enthusiasts for psychoanalysis, now began to question why psychoanalysis had become so powerful in America. Was it really because it benefited individuals? Or had it in fact become a form of constraint in the interests of social order? The critics included Monroe's ex-husband, Arthur Miller.
My argument with so much psychoanalysis is the preconception that suffering is a mistake, or a sign of weakness, or a sign even of illness, when in fact, possibly the greatest truths we know have come out of people's suffering. That the problem is not to undo suffering or to wipe it off the face of the earth, but to make it inform our lives, instead of trying to cure ourselves of it constantly and avoid it, and avoid anything but that lobotomized sense of what they call happiness. There's too much of an attempt, it seems to me, to think in terms of controlling man rather than freeing him, of defining him rather than letting him go. Mm-hmm. And it's part of the whole ideology of this age, which is power mad.
Hey, have you heard about the crazy new way to send a message today? It's flashed on a screen, too quick to see, but still you get it subliminally.
At the same time, an onslaught was launched on the way psychoanalysis was being used by business to control people. The first blow came with the bestseller, The Hidden Persuaders, written by Vance Packard. It accused psychoanalysts of reducing the American people to emotional puppets whose only function was to keep the mass production lines running. They did this by manipulating people's unconscious desires to create longings for ever new brands and models. They had turned the population into unwitting participants in the system of planned obsolescence. The second blow came from an influential philosopher and social critic, Herbert Marcuse. He had been trained in psychoanalysis.
This is a childish application of psychoanalysis, which does not take at all into consideration the very real political systematic waste of resources, of technology and of the productive process. For example, planned obsolescence. For example, the production of innumerable brands and gadgets who are, in the last analysis, all the same. The production of innumerable different marks of automobiles. And this prosperity at the same time, consciously or unconsciously, leads to a kind of schizophrenic existence. I believe that in this society an incredible quantum of aggressiveness and destructiveness is accumulated precisely because of the empty prosperity, which then simply erupts.
Marcuse's argument was not simply that psychoanalysis had been used for corrupt purposes, it was more fundamental. Marcuse said that the very idea that you needed to control people was wrong. Human beings did have inner emotional drives, but they were not inherently violent or evil. It was society that made these drives dangerous by repressing and distorting them. Anna Freud and her followers had increased that repression by trying to make people conform to society. In so doing, they made people more dangerous, not less.
Marcuse challenged that social world, and he said that's a world that should not be adapted to. And in fact, what the individual was adapting to was corrupt and evil and corrupting. In other words, he switched the source of evil from inward conflict to the society itself. That the sickness of society lay at the society level, not at the sickness of human beings in it. And if people did not challenge that, then they were, in fact, submitting to evil.
Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. It is the ringing cry of modern child psychology, maladjusted. Now, of course, we all want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But as I move toward my conclusion, I would like to say to you today, in a very honest manner, that there are some things in our society and some things in our world for which I'm proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to racial segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few and leave millions of God's children smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society.
Okay, so we're back, and going to go over some things today. Going to keep on lecturing on Adam Curtis's documentary, The Century of the Self, which I feel, kind of rounds out, our entire analysis of image-making technology, and specifically in the ways that it is used to shape our subjectivity, shape our minds, shape our consent. And I think we've come full circle with Curtis, from the Matrix to Curtis. I think that we've woven a thread, and Curtis gives us a piece of a very, very dense history. There's a lot going on in these 4 episodes. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of jumping off points too for final projects. I know it's really, really late in the game, But, as I watch it again, and as I watch it a couple times in order to prep for these lectures, I realize how many different things, how many different historical developments happen over the course of, the 20th century that tie into everything that we've talked about previously, whether it be the Matrix as an allegory, the way that Berger kind of builds a history, going further back, the ways in which Sontag and Bazin look at photography, and then Benson coming in and talking about this kind of shift, and it's all of a piece. It's all a society of the spectacle, and I think it's all this kind of vast history. And I honestly believe that the course really, in order to do the material justice, I think that the course really needs like 2 semesters, because I feel remiss to the degree that we spend every semester the course changes out of necessity, due to the fact that, you're dealing with, rapidly evolving circumstances. I mean, look at the last couple months, folks. It's like rapidly different ways of communicating and processing images and manipulating images that, it almost always behooves me to have to kind of tweak the material. It's not a course that allows one to just kind of go into one's file cabinet at the beginning of the semester and get out the same thing and go through the same thing. It needs to be, evolving, and it needs to be organic, to the degree that, it's like image making technology, especially during, your generation, has, escalated to a degree and in so many different modalities that we're still catching up with, like, trying to find out, like, what it's doing to us. So, there's all that, but, going back to, like, kind of being remiss, we don't really talk about, and I don't think Berger, and a lot of these other thinkers that we've unpacked this semester talk enough about, the double-edged nature of images, how images and image-making technology can coerce us and enslave us, but at the same time, the ways in which images and art and film and television and documentaries and all these different counter movements to push against the mainstream forms of image ideology, that's all there too. How art has played such a political and social role and social justice movements and anti-authoritarian movements, and how documentaries like, dare I say, like, documentaries by Michael Moore, documentaries by Earl Morris are ways of, engendering self-awareness to what's going on, and that critical element of the image and this kind of tug of war that goes on. Sometimes we have more time to deal with that, but under the prevailing conditions, I took the route that we've taken. I think it was a sound route, given, what I think my mission statement and my vocation kind of instructs me to do, which is to make you aware and to give you that allegorical, metaphorical, like, red pill, to, like, wake up to the conditions that, you find yourself in, in 2020, so, there's that, and, some of the things that Adam Curtis has to say in episodes 2 and 3, I think tie directly to the situation that we're finding ourselves in right now, kiddies, economically, in terms of the ways that the mainstream media is managing certain things, and the ways in which the corporate state is utilizing, their apparatus as a way of managing people, and as a way of managing the fear, too. We're going to talk about the ways in which fear is engendered in masses of people. Today we're going to talk about, the ways in which fear isn't eliminated but is manipulated, and tweaked in order to get you to, ascribe to a certain belief or, engage in a certain activity. We're going to get into all that today. Just want to get, really, really back and reiterating some house cleaning that we have to do out of necessity today. First thing, final projects. I've been getting a trickle of proposals for final projects, and it's like I said, I'm not asking a lot with you on the final projects. The midterm papers have been coming back, the revisions, and I've been getting them back. Most of you should have gotten back at this point. I have a few still flying out there. But once again, I'm missing papers from people, missing redrafts from people. And I know that, it's primarily due to not some delinquency on your fault, but the fact that there's this kind of flurry of information going on in your email accounts and trying to keep track of it all. So, I'm going to be, exceedingly fair and lenient and, godfatherly, not like Marlon Brando Godfather, but, kind of godfatherly about, kind of assessing all the information. And, I don't see anybody failing the course. I really don't. And there's I can't see any conceivable reason to, but the way that I will do grade assessments will basically be, kind of looking at, what's there, what's not there, bringing up your work and taking a look, and then also looking at the comments too, and it's like, I stress the comments a lot because I put a lot into these videos, but at the same time, it's like, there's been like these noticeable paucities, and these notable silences with certain people on the blog, and it's like, it's not really going to make or break you, I'm a little bit dismayed about, some people who just kind of zoned out. But then again, I know what the conditions are out there. I know what's going on. I know it's been hard to keep up with a lot of different things. I've tried to just kind of like, do due diligence with a lot of this and keep my side of the street clean to keep, and I think that, ultimately I think that a lot of my decision-making processes were sound, about going the video route as opposed to, doing Zoom for a lot of different reasons that kind of feed into, everything that we've talked about the dehumanizing nature of the digital, but are also, too intricate to really talk about. I find that this format has been exceedingly difficult for me due to the fact that, I'm primarily like a brick and mortar guy. I need to play to an audience, and that. So it's hard. It's hard to kind of do that, under these conditions. But, I've tried to step up to it. So final projects will be due the last day of class, which is going to be Tuesday, the 19th. If you're going to do a paper, and if you're going to do a paper, 3 to 5 pages, at least 3 pages. 2-page, if you're going to do like a PowerPoint presentation, I want a couple pages, explaining what I'm looking at, because, I need some context, for that. Or, option 3 would be to do a video, kind of like the ones that I've been doing where, you tackle a subject and like 10 to 20 minutes and you do it as a presentation, which is normally what we would do, in the last couple days in a brick and mortar setting. I would, kind of schedule out, like usually like you have 5 presentations per day, because that's about the amount of time that it takes to critique them and present them. So those are your options. For those of you who have not floated proposals my way yet, I would suggest, even beforehand, making sure that your proposals, for instance, it's like if you're going to do something like, well, I want to do an episode of blah, 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 you know, it's like, I don't want just a review. I don't want just, 3 pages of explaining me to the plot of, like, oh, I want to do Hunger Games, because it's kind of like The Matrix. No and no. If you're going to do something like that, you need to connect it to the material. You have to have logical and viable reasons for why you feel that this particular issue or this particular piece of media connects to what we're saying, and you need to be able to connect it to the media that we've gone over. That should just go without saying. Possible ideas. We kind of went through all this. As far as the content of your project, can speak to any of numerous this cornucopia of different ideas and tying things together or making a case for something. That should just go. That most people don't have a lot of issues, generating something, ultimately coming up with something that, if you bring it to me, we tweak it. We kind of do it back and forth via email or over the phone. Remember, it's Tuesday as I'm doing this. It's probably going to be Wednesday before I get this out, but, you need to, we got a week left. So, you need to get on it. I want to get back to where we were in Curtis. We were talking about the ways in which Edward Bernays, who had been Freud's American nephew, had used some of Freud's overarching ideas on what human beings inherently were in order to kind of shape this whole industry of public relations, and how he would use public relations not only in the political sector but also in the corporate sector, and how he would become this kind of business guru and this political consultant. And we see in episode 2, The Engineering of Consent, how a lot of these things get a little more, dare I say, nefarious, if not outright evil. I feel safe using that word. There's kind of like some evil intents going on here with a lot of this manipulation, especially when it starts to produce all kinds of dead bodies, in war or in coup or in phony coups that are set up for corporate interests, and we're going to find out a lot about that, But we had left on this kind of optimistic note. I had quoted President Herbert Hoover, who had consulted Bernays. Hoover would come in right at the beginning of the stock market crash of 90. He would be our president during the stock market crash of 1929. And he would be our president during that Great Depression, kind of like the role in which Trump is finding himself in right now as the president who is presiding over this current collapse, And but before the collapse, he is primarily convinced of the idea that, first of all, we have to go back to this idea that there's these two kind of conflicting philosophies about these two kind of conflicting psychological philosophies that also map to political philosophies about what a human being inherently is and how that person needs to be managed or treated or allowed, or on the other side, how one can elicit rationality and freedom, out of that person. And there will be, and will be this tug of war that goes on throughout the 20th century. Those of you who have watched the series will see that, so that there was every reason in the world to be optimistic about this. And I ended the last lecture by, speaking to the idea that everything was kind of going good, but it was all kind of premised on this idea of the consuming self, the docile self, man as consumer, man as this kind of self-centered, egotistical creature that was kind of looking out for number one, and how that overarching ethos would also inform the elites. This whole it was kind of like a me decade in the 1920s, and how that sense of self, that sense of I can do what I want to do, when I want to do it, would ultimately have catastrophic consequences that would lead first to the Great Depression of the 1930s, and then as a follow up to that, the most brutal and global world war that the world would ever see. So it would ultimately beg the question. It would ultimately start to beg the question, if we were so good, it's like World War II would be an arena and a teachable moment in which we would have to ultimately ask ourselves, we thought we were the most advanced civilization that the world had ever seen. We had the most advanced technology, the most advanced medicine. We had all this stuff. Why did it go so horribly wrong? Why did this pinnacle of technological advancement and civilization lead to such barbarism? And this is where we start to tap into Freud, and other people to kind of explain what had happened. So, it's like, and there will be two different variations on this. The one coming out of Europe was pretty much hinged on, the forces that were going on in Europe were primarily hinged on this idea that democracy there was a lot of places like Germany and Italy and Spain where there were these ideas kind of like percolating that democracy as such, knowing what we knew about the savage, inner, hidden resources of the human being, could not be trusted, and that democracy was impossible. That there was this idea that democracy as such was impossible. It was impossible in order to keep an economy going. Hence, we see this flavor of political management spring up called fascism, in which people were looked at, and a lot of energy was expended on this idea of looking at people not as individuals, but how the masses could be controlled or manipulated in a way in which those self-destructive barbaric forces would be useful. And I'm gonna stop. It's the middle of the day. It's driving me fucking crazy. So we have that variant going on, all right? On the other side of the Atlantic, we have this period of civility in which an administration comes in that basically predicates all of its decision-making processes on this idea of people as being fairly rational if given the right context, if given the right circumstances, if given the data and information that people, this kind of optimistic view of human rationality in which, basically the tenets of which are, the human being is inherently rational if given the right conditions, inherently rational if given the right information, if given the right data, and not talked down to, and not condescended to, and not treated like a bunch of morons, And this administration that would be led by Roosevelt would operate along these lines, and that this idea and these ideas that get embodied in some of his policies. We'll get back to that. In the beginning, before the war starts, Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister for the Reich, for the Third Reich, for the Nazis, given all of his abominable actions, was a highly intelligent person, and we see in the Curtis documentary how he saw Roosevelt's New Deal and a lot of those social programs as being like the right route. What went wrong, we'll explain later on that there were different conditions, in Weimar Germany than there were here, at far different conditions, but that, these ideas were, respected. So that ultimately, one of the motifs that kind of drives the whole narrative, Curtis's whole narrative, is these can be reduced down to this kind of two conflicting models of the human being, in which the first is kind of like, a model of the human being as the angry mob, driven by the irrational, the role that the irrational plays in the unconscious, and the selfish desires, and how, a whole philosophy of thought springs up in which those selfish desires and that irrational needs to be managed and contained and controlled up to the point of taking away people's freedom. Ultimately, not taking away people's freedom, as opposed to, a model of the collective and individual psyche in which we were inherently reasonable. We were inherently capable of acting collectively, and given the right soil, given the right context, we would grow and spring up and make rational decisions. And ultimately we find out, through, and we talk about this in Society of the Spectacle, what Roosevelt's whole, policy apparatus would entail for the ruling class, and corporations saw all of his different policies as being this huge threat, and rightly so, because it put power back into the hands of the people, through. This is just redundant, this whole idea of a rational democracy runs counter to corporate interests due to the fact that corporations tend to generate capital, huge amounts of capital, due to getting you to buy something or to get you to invest in something, sometimes to an irrational degree, and the rational citizen, the model that, the Roosevelt administration was operating under, ran directly counter that. And we talked about that in our lead up to the Society of the Spectacle, how corporations wanted to gain their power back through things like, kind of demonizing organized labor and engendering fear through the Red Scare and all kinds of kind of manipulative techniques that guys like Edward Bernays would ultimately help and be the architect of. All right, so there's this kind of like there's this period of relative rationality that's kind of driven by a kind of state planning, and this backlash that happens through corporations. And the corporations, as we see in episode 1, at the end of episode 1, launched this fierce propaganda and public relations campaign against all these ideas that neoconservatives and the great the great conservative and Republican resurgence that happens after the Clinton administration are basically these kind of reiterations, these kind of like puppet-like, reiterations of the same kind of things that were being that the Roosevelt administration were being accused of, like too much government, like too much social planning, not enough like freedom. Freedom meaning like laissez-faire capitalism freedom, not like individual freedoms individual constitutional freedoms as opposed to corporations being like left to do what unencumbered by these nasty little nuisances like regulation and and labor unions and the rights of the workers. These things were nuisances, that needed to be, so the whole idea, so, people always talking about, tax and spend liberals, and this entire insane drama that's played itself out in these warring ideologies will kind of find their initial their initial impetus in the backlash against the New Deal, the backlash against a kind of social democracy that wasn't being driven by corporate capitalism, that was predicated by the ideas of more in line with Roosevelt. Kind of brought us back into line with some of the overarching propositions and values by which the founding fathers had initially instituted the republic. These ideas of fraternity, equality, and liberty that had been hadn't been perfect, but was a project. This like American project that is ultimately over and over again, contested by this kind of sleight of hand, reinterpreting freedom as and limiting the definition of freedom as always alluding to economic freedom above all other freedoms, and the havoc that limiting definition of freedom has to do in the body politic, that is mostly, consist of people just trying to get by, So this idea of rational democracy, and he would do it through things that we talk about in the other class, mass media research, things like Gallup and Roper. We find out about these things. They start this whole system of polling the people through surveys and through these mass surveys and these mass questionnaires. All right, and all of it is kind of hinged on it's very scientific. It's another variety of scientific management, but it's a variety of scientific management that tends to be aware of trying to be as truthful as one can with your subject, and framing your survey and your survey questions within a framework in which there's no coercion. There's no coercion. Both Gallup and Roper were very, they were sticklers for this idea of having this relationship with the American public in which you were treated, you weren't condescended to, you weren't being manipulated, so that the questionnaires themselves, it's like these committees would get together, of social scientists to put together, these questionnaires that would would do their homework and double check their questions and make sure, for instance, there's this interchange in the documentary between these two guys putting together a questionnaire, and the one proposes a certain question to ask the American public, and another one counters with the fact that no, it's too biased. It's too biased. You should rephrase it so that the answer that elicits. It's the whole idea of leading questions and avoiding. If you're going to be empirical and you're going to be unbiased about stuff, you need to frame your research in a way in which you're not just getting what you want out of it, all right? Which would basically be the playbook of corporate industry. They would be the flip side of that. They would be all about, and they would call upon, and who would they call back into the game? Edward Bernays, to help them get the power back. The power of tapping back, of getting rid of this whole rational thing. We don't want this rational thing going on, and getting it back into a place where they can tap into people's irrational ideas and desires and selfishness, and corporate America would fight back. We see, how General Motors and a lot of the other big corporations will get together and really kind of rewrite, there's a revisionist history that goes on in the late 40s and early 50s about who was responsible for bringing the economy back, and like corporate robber barons usually do, they get their tentacles out and they go into all different kinds of areas, and they plant all these stories, and they rewrite things, and they plant misrepresentations of what really happened as this kind of campaign, against this campaign whose ultimate goal was to make the American public look at government as being a threat, as being intrusive, as not allowing you to do what you wanted to do. And this campaign that was launched by corporate America was not resisted by the American government. The American government and American big business would kind of go at it for a while, to the point where we see, these, the government would launch these educational films, in order to educate the public from everything from media literacy. If you see in at the end of episode 1, it's there are these educational films being produced by the American government, these how-to manuals for how to look for media bias in corporate controlled newspapers, how to do what we call in media studies content analysis, and they were literally giving the American public the tools to look and be media literate, and to look through and to look for bias and stuff like that. But it was and as Curtis says, it was just no match for the machinations of corporate advertising, and it would all kind of culminate in this 1939 World's Fair in New York, in which corporate America would unleash this vision of technological, of affluence and prosperity for all, if one just kind of aligned themselves with consumerism. Basically, they sold the American public a utopian vision of a world that was predicated on consumption. It was a consumer's utopia that they were looking for, and that was accompanied by this whole overarching philosophy within corporate America of the idea that, once again, that the American public couldn't be trusted to make their own decisions. The decisions had to be made for them as to what to buy, because, once again, their model of the human being was that he couldn't be trusted. He or she couldn't be trusted. That ultimately, and after the war, and after we see the carnage of the war, there is, every reason to go back to Freud's ideas and take and kind of cherry pick Freud's ideas, because we're going to find that Freud's overarching oeuvre wasn't as simple. It wasn't as simple as a lot of what would ultimately become the psychoanalysis industry in this country, and it was an industry, and the corporate and government, ultimate utilization of Freud's ideas. After the New Deal, the government kind of gives up on this whole man as rational animal thing and kind of goes back. Hence, as things start to progress through the 50s and 60s, government and big business will become fond friends once again. And hence, even by the point of Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, who had been a military general, would warn in a speech to the American public to beware of the military-industrial complex. He's the one that coined the term, so that we can understand the ways in which this machine kind of starts to set itself up, and it gets what it predicts. It ultimately gets what it predicts. Episode 2 starts at the end of it shows the ascendancy of psychoanalysis in post-war America. Sorry, it's crazy right now. It shows the ascendancy of the psychoanalytic industry in post-war America due to the fact that a lot of these American servicemen and women that were drafted and served in the war were coming back with a lot of significant psychological problems. What we nowadays know and term as being post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. And psychoanalysis felt that it was up to it was like within their purview to like deal with this. But after everything is said and done, we ultimately have to understand that once again, they shift the model of the human being back to this idea of the human being being inherently warlike, inherently irrational, inherently selfish, and if left unchecked, will basically rip down whatever there is of society. But herein lies the rub with it, and they'll go back and say, and they will be as outlandish as to propose that the problems that American servicemen were having when they came back from the war didn't have to do with the idea of being in mortal danger for prolonged periods of time, didn't have to do with watching their war buddies and comrades obliterated and excoriated standing right next to them, didn't have to do with the idea of killing other human beings and taking them out of the world, but that ultimately all of their problems stemmed from some prior trauma, some childhood trauma that got re-unleashed under the stress of battle. Once again, it wasn't, and being able to continue to promulgate this idea, where any rational human being at that point would probably have objected that, the reasons why these American military and servicemen were coming back all fucked up was due to the fact that you made them do what they did. You forced them to go and do what they did. And it had nothing to do with what was inherent to them, and that all the PTSD and all the distress and all the anxiety had to do with the fact that we're inherently rash. When everything is said and done, it speaks to Roosevelt's model of the human being. Roosevelt's model of the human being saying that, it's like given the right circumstances, people tend to be, and you see it in your own lives, kiddies. You see it in your own lives, that, people have a tendency, after everything is said and done, when people are treated with respect and dignity and know where their next meal is coming from and have work that they feel some kind of dignity and pride over, and life isn't this like constant struggle against other people, that within those kind of prevailing conditions, people tend to act pretty civil and pretty rational, and under those prevailing conditions, no one ever really feels the need to go and go and kill people, go and kill a bunch of people because you're being taken care of. It's like, so once again, it's like, but they never ask that. They never pose that question. The other question, the other glaring question that never gets asked is this. The question that is posed is this: if Freud's model of the human being as being inherently savage, inherently irrational, inherently selfish, it is to hold firm, all right, and is this general model of what we are as human beings, what led the elite social organizers and planners to think that they were somehow immune to it? How did they feel that they were somehow above and beyond it? If it was something that was in all of our natures, why did they? It's like they never questioned that. They never questioned their inherent complicity in this overall view of the world, of this overall view of man. No one, not even Curtis, asked the primary question. If the savage instinctual core lies at the center of the human being, why did the planners and psychoanalysts feel that they were exempt? And it had to do with, once again, and we can almost go back to Berger with this kind of hierarchical elitism of the ruling classes, of thinking that they were superior. That somehow the masses were one thing and the social planners were something entirely different, So that ultimately what will happen in academia, and it will be launched by, Bernays' daughter. They do an interview with Edward Bernays' daughter, and she talks about her father, and you remember the scene with her father, with her talking about her father, and she was like, he thought people were stupid. He used that word a lot. People were stupid. And the press was stupid, and this person was stupid, and government was stupid. It kind of sounded a lot like someone on our current political landscape that has a tendency to have the same kind of conception of human beings, okay? This kind of elitism that drove, they never questioned their own possible savagery. They never questioned the idea that these very forms of repression were in and of themselves a kind of instinctual need to control other people. They never second-guessed themselves like that. Ultimately, it would take a group of European philosophers who two of the main players within this school of psychology and philosophy were a guy by the name of Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. They were part of a group that would later go on to be called the Frankfurt School of Cultural and Critical Theory. And they would write a book they would write a lot of books, but one of their primary texts would be called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And they would pose this exact question of the idea of society and social planning and the Enlightenment. They would go back as far as historically, this break in the 16th century of empirical science and rationality would be considered this paradigmatic break with religion and mysticism, this whole idea of this rise and rational secular humanism and the Enlightenment would be seen as would be at least purported to be this break with what had come before. What Adorno and Horkheimer would ultimately propose in this book, Dialectic Enlightenment, was that it was just another variation on the same thing, and that what rational thought consisted of was nothing more than this kind of continuation of these kind of instincts that we had, and they made a very, very controversial assertion concerning the idea that that what we considered to be rational at that point still had its origins in this kind of barbarism, because they wanted to understand the question I posed in the beginning of the lecture. How did the most advanced society that the world had ever seen, decay into this mass genocide of most of Judaism in Western Europe, this mass genocide on the island of Japan? It's like, if we had been so goddamn rational, why were there so many bodies? Why were there so many bodies? Piles and piles of bodies. This rational, advanced civilization. And they would question it. And they would try to get to the core of it and try to understand the ways in which the system itself and the rational and supposedly logical and scientific ideas of the day were somewhat skewed and had kind of stemmed from the same need to extract and control that had been inculcated in the civilization from the beginning. Remember when Berger talks about this whole idea of art being this kind of propaganda machine for possessing things, for extracting things. So they would say the same thing about science and rationality, and say that, and they would come up with this whole kind of very, very sophisticated philosophical standpoint that it would take courses and courses and courses to go through, but ultimately they would start this whole philosophy of double guessing our motives, of thinking about possibilities that came from standing back and being critical of everything, critical of human thought, critical of human civilization, and this whole idea, this whole philosophical process of what would be called negation only meaning that you would go through this process of kind of looking at what you were doing and standing off and apart from it and being able to second guess it, and being a little more ambivalent in decisions and policy making, knowing that they could be predicated on a form of rationality that was really about control. And we'll see this need for control play itself out in episode 2 through Freud's daughter Anna, and through Edward Bernays again. So there was that. There was all that comes out, you know. So this PTSD, and then in episode 2 they talk to a wartime German immigrant psychoanalyst by the name of Martin Bergman that talks about, you know, a lot of immigrant German sociologists and psychologists were enlisted in this American effort to try to kind of manage all this grief, all this psychic trauma, you know, and Martin Bergman will go on to say, you know, it's like I traveled the country and I would like, you know, I would be, you know, I'd have all these clients and I'd have all these patients, you know, coming out of like supposedly this like placid, you know, normal suburbia, and they had all these problems, and he was like, I finally recognized that behind all these idyllic white picket fences there was infinite grief and wounding and sadness. He said, and he goes as far as saying that America, he said, is a far, far sadder country than they will admit to. They're a far, 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 far more afflicted country, you know, than they want to admit to, you know, and we need to get to the origins of why. Why did that happen? Why was it like that? Why did it happen? A sadder country than one would imagine, he says. And that's very chilling. It's very chilling. You know, we're going to talk a little bit later on about this. Wilhelm Reich will come on the scene later on. He will be one of Freud's students who, in episode 3, will directly kind of confront and be pushed out of the psychoanalytical movement. But that's coming up in a little bit. But you know, the things we need to know at this point is that Anna Freud kind of takes the baton from her father, and you know, from, you know, she lived in England, but would be very, very influential, as well as like Edward Bernays, in spreading Freud's ideas to the American public at large. And this whole kind of immigrant wave of European psychoanalysts will come at the behest of the American government to come and they're like, well, we got the tools. You know, we have the tools to deal with these problems, these psychoses and these neuroses and these phobias and all this kind of traumatic behavior, and we'll use psychoanalysts. We'll use psychoanalysis to psychoanalyze people so that all these clinics spring up, you know, to try to quote help people, you know, and their goals, you know, I mean, to not totally demonize them. I mean, their goals were predicated on ideas that they wanted to do good, you know, that they ultimately looked at, you know, it's like they had this model of the human being, you know, they wanted to basically free people from these neuroses and these psychosis and all this supposedly unconscious, unresolved, ugly shit, you know, make them more productive human beings, you know. But herein lies the rub in this whole kind of psychoanalytical revolution, all right? It's like they want to make them more vital. They want to make them more adjusted, you know, and Anna Freud herself will take on this project, this little like social experiment of her own with her friend Dorothy Burlingham's kids, who have just suffered from a divorce, and psychoanalyze all them. But the whole model and the whole process and the whole goal will ultimately lead to, you know, arguably, you know, a less neurotic, more well-adjusted human being. But really, it was more about making people normal and conformity, and, you know, and then corporate America kind of got into it and saw all the benefits of psychoanalysis, so that psychic health And psychic normality became equated with, suburban consumer morality. And to be healthy, and be able to express yourself and to be prosperous had to do with, being normal, and we would see, and ultimately all these attempts at normalizing people into docile consumers would have catastrophic backlashes to them. That we'll talk about. So Anna Freud worked with the Burlinghams. She worked with the Burlingham's children. Curtis goes on to say, the other thing that needs to be pointed out here is that, for instance, Curtis does an interview with one of the Burlingham grandchildren, who gives us the dark side of the whole experiment, and contends that it's like the one son, they psychoanalyzed the one son due to the fact that they had fears that he was a closeted homosexual, and they wanted to cure him of that. And Curtis in the interview asked the grandson, why did they want to cure him of that? And the grandson replies, because they didn't feel that it was normal. Hence, and here we go. And the ball just starts rolling from that. What constitutes normalcy? What constitutes happiness? What constitutes well-adjustedness is all predicated on this very, very limited idea of the nuclear family, and Freud's ideas on what was healthy, because Freud, after everything is said and done, it's like Freud felt that, sexual evolution, and we get into this in the other class when we do psychoanalytic criticism, that psychosexual evolution, if it was normal, had to occur along heterosexual lines. And the whole thing was just this kind of warped, because one thing that has always kind of been implicated was that Anna Freud and Dorothy were lovers, that she was a closeted lesbian, and they were living together in a home in England, and Anna herself, was probably so conflicted and such a raging contradiction in the ideas that she was trying to put out there, that when something comes out of those kind of when a whole movement comes out of total hypocrisy, ultimately, what can we say? It's ultimately probably doomed to kind of like collapse on its own weight, And in episode 2, Curtis will basically catalog the different, sometimes nefarious, psychological projects that were conducted by the psychoanalytic industry and by American government and corporations, to often very deleterious ends. There's a quote, normal but not healthy. Even Truman, by like 1946, he sees like the fallout from, the psychological distress that was caused by people coming back from the war, and turns mental health into an issue as a national crisis. He kind of brands it as a national crisis because there's enough of it going on that he'll sign a bill, the National Mental Health Bill, which will allocate all this money primarily to psychoanalysis to like kind of come up with the solution. The analysis of the Burlinghams, Curtis says, the analysis appeared to be a great success, and in the 30s the Burlingham children had returned to America. They settled down to healthy married lives in the suburbs. What they didn't realize was that their experience was about to become a template for a giant social experiment to control the inner mental life of the American population. He brings in a contrasting voice in the interview with a guy by the name of Dr. Neil Smelzer. And, I quote from him at length here because I think his quote was very, very significant. He says to Curtis about about Anna Freud and this whole movement, including psychoanalytical use in big business. They just felt that the road to happiness was in adapting to the external world in which they lived, that people would become uncrippled from their own neurotic conflicts and impulses, that they would not engage in self-destructive behavior, that they would, in fact, adapt to the reality about them. They never questioned the reality. They never questioned the reality that they were supposedly needed to become adjusted to. They never questioned that the reality itself might be a source of evil or something to which you could not adapt without compromise or without suffering or without exploiting yourself in some way. So there was this fit with the politics of the day. And the politics of the day was predicated on certain overarching values, about, the sanctity of the nuclear heterosexual family, the sanctity of affluence, the sanctity of the American dream of this kind of stability and consumption and having stuff, and the whole milieu, the whole American milieu, of affluence and having stuff, So there's that, So we start to see with that, with this whole shift and what constituted, basically, the concept of what constitutes normality at this point in the 50s is ultimately being dictated by this combination now of big business and government that feels that a docile consuming capitalist nuclear family is the model of health, and hence what we have is a kind of, and hence we see the beginnings of what I would term and other people have termed this kind of financialization of everyday life, this kind of financialization of relationships, of leisure time, of the arts, and we've gone through the whole enchilada this semester. We've gone through the whole enchilada about how all of these, things that, all these different phenomenon, all these different social aspects and psychological and artistic and spiritual aspects of human life ultimately turned into another product of exchange, another commodity, another thing to be bought and sold on the market. And that includes the financialization of the nuclear family. The financialization of the nuclear family. That a family, this sickness that kind of starts to infect the nuclear family as being a unit of consumption, and the idea which will kind of conflate with all these other different social institutions, that we'll buy into the financialization of everything. When we start hearing politicians and we start seeing this whole view of America as a business, it's no longer a family, it's a business, all right? And all the emotional and spiritual and psychological fallout that will come out of that model. and the ways that it will trickle down into your lives, into your families. This financialization and the ways in which that which was at one time sacred is ultimately commodified and polluted by being financialized. And there's a new show out. It's been on for a few seasons. A lot of it's like there's overarching genre of shows, especially since cable television. And it kind of and it's been around for a long time, but family dramas that kind of play on the crisis and catastrophe of financializing the nuclear family. All right, the first, like The Sopranos, Weeds, like this whole slew of shows that shows like the oncoming catastrophe of this financialization of turning your family into a business, in order to deal with whatever social or economic inequities are out there. And the show Ozark that came out for Netflix, I've been watching this, and I think that it is a prodigious and brilliant kind of strong critique of the ways in which the family and it's like how far it can go, because within the show, we have this family that's basically laundering money for this like Mexican drug cartel, and the father, the lead character Marty, played by Jason Bateman, really is one of these kind of cold kind of technocrats who sees the whole thing. We really see everything kind of through his eyes and his wife's eyes, and how they get corrupted by this idea right from the beginning of the family as a business, and how it all starts to like cave in on them. So this whole phenomenon, like financializing all aspects of life that weren't previously financialized. Back to this timeline, it's like a guy by the name of Ernest Dichter will come along, who would become another apostate, another sycophant of this whole movement of psychic health, the healthy consumer being a healthy human being, and would go as far as setting up a what he called the Institute for Motivational Research in Montreal, and it was just really about having focus groups about like products, and serving the American consumer, giving them what they wanted through like through focus groups, and that this like picture of mental health becomes consonant with this idea of the this picture of mental health becomes consonant with the idea of the satisfied consumer. Are you satisfied with your shit, with the stuff you're buying? And that connect will become, the main goal. Consumption is health. Consumption is health, And Curtis gives this example. Curtis gives an example of like how the Betty Crocker company would put out these Betty Crocker cake mix. I grew up with them. I lived in my mother, and it's like, well, my mother used to make stuff from scratch too. She never like really bought into this whole thing, but Curtis like uses them as an example. Like Betty Crocker had this instant cake mix, and they couldn't, and people thought it was a great idea, but nobody was buying it. None of the suburban housewives were like buying it, and they went to a psychoanalyst, and they're like, why aren't people buying this? And the psychoanalyst came back to them with this whole Freudian reading of the situation, and they said that there was this guilt, there was this sense of guilt in the homemaker / mom that it was too easy. It was too easy, and there's this sense of guilt and shame that she wasn't working hard enough. So what they decide to do is include in the recipe the idea of adding an egg. Just adding an egg, right? That hadn't been there before. And that there and the psychoanalyst would also like imply that there was this whole idea of the maternal mother figure kind of sacrificing her own eggs into this in a kind of symbolic way. Look at my lectures on psychoanalysis if you want to understand. And then once they added an egg, it's like the product sword due to this kind of psychoanalytic manipulation of the mass of primarily the homemaker, the female homemaker, to get over her guilt at it being too easy, and we'll see this kind of manipulation fall into all different aspects of life that I wish we were together that we could just like talk about it. Really, the phenomena of the soap opera is like it's just craziness. The next thing that will spring up, the next crisis that will spring up, once again, we're back into this position of crisis as financial and corporate and governmental opportunity. After the war, we're back into this kind of affluent society of the 50s, this kind of affluent conformist normalcy, and at the same time, it's like, anytime things get a little too idyllic in this situation, something needs to be, either there's a perceived threat or an actual threat in which the technocrats and the social planners can generate some kind of fear around it, whether it be a real threat or a perceived threat. This time it was the Red Scare. And we've talked about the Red Scare, this threat of the Soviet Union, and the threat of this counter way of life, and that's not taking away from the fact that there were real geopolitical threats from the Soviet Union, just like there's like real biological and health effects from the pandemic, but when governments are given an opportunity in which fear is a major component, they will always find different kinds of mechanisms to use and manage that fear as a form of control, as a form of surveillance, as a form of getting something out of it that they want. And it becomes a question of not getting rid of the fear as much as it did with managing the fear. With managing the fear, and we already talked about this with the Red Scare and the management of fear. And I'm going to end with this. A doctor comes along. Once again, another person comes out from the psychoanalytical community that propose that, and government and. One of the big fears that the American government and the American military had was this idea that the Russians, the Soviet Union, was engaging in all these kind of real nefarious, devilish psychological experiments of brainwashing and psychological manipulation on its people in order to get them to kind of go with the flow. And there was this fear within the American military complex that we were kind of dropping the ball on the whole mind control thing. So that all these projects were funded by the CIA in this country, the Central Intelligence Agency, these experiments to manipulate the American public, and literally, see what they could do with it, where it could go. And most of these failures is Freudian slip. And most of these experiments, as Curtis points out, were not only like highly unethical and pretty much fucking evil. But they were all like just terrible, terrible failures. And there was this one guy, Dr. Ewan McCameron, who was basically like, it's like, why even deal with the unconscious at all? Why deal with the irrational at all? Why don't we, through a series of, why don't we just set up a clinic and we'll experiment on like just giving people these high doses of electroshock therapy, which had been being used already in the psychiatric community in limited ways, and with admittedly partial successes in curing things like depression and stuff like that. Why don't we like take electroconvulsive therapy with a combination of like just massive amounts of like hallucinogenic drugs and put them in people and just wipe all that shit right out. Just wipe the slate clean. You know, and so that if we can just like gut the human psyche, and this is real. This was real, you know, and was funded by the CIA. Somebody actually, this was a proposal, and rational minds spent all kinds of this to underwrite it. All right, and the results were disastrous. Hundreds of people suffered memory loss, suffered all kinds of trauma, you know, and in the next lecture I'm going to talk about how we took all of that, how the CIA kind of takes psychoanalysis and uses Edward Bernays as a tool in other countries and in other political agendas. But let's just end with that. I just don't feel like I'm on my game today, but I think I've done a pretty good job of unpacking this. So let's get those proposals in, folks. You know, let's get working on those final projects. I hope you're well. And I'm going to probably I think I'm just going to have to limit myself to doing one more lecture. I think that's all I'm going to have time with. And I'll just try to do a really good job at unpacking I think that the meat of Century of the Self is the first 3 episodes. All right, we'll touch a little bit on episode 4, but episode 4 is just kind of like an epilogue, you know. But we will touch upon it. So once again, let's get those projects together. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're like, you know, acclimatizing yourself to the situation. You know, I've really thought about like doing a lecture on like, just for both classes, a kind of valedictory lecture on like, you know, things you can do to like maintain your sanity and, you know, all that. I might do that. I might actually do that. Not that I'm the poster boy for it, but I have some tips and tricks. You know, maybe I'll do that. So anyway, hope you're all well. Take care of yourself.